What made you lose your faith in humanity? A young woman showed up at my front door crying her eyes out. She looked 22 with mascara running down her cheeks and her hands shaking. My wife Rebecca and I had been drinking celebrating our anniversary, so we were both a little buzzed when this girl appeared out of nowhere. She said she was lost and couldn't find her boyfriend's house. She said he lived somewhere near the county jail, which was a 15-minute walk from our place. She kept wiping her nose with her sleeve and looking around like she was scared someone was following her. Rebecca gave me that look that meant we should help, so I told the girl I'd walk her over there. Rebecca wanted to come too, but I told her to stay and watch the grill. The girl seemed relieved when I agreed to help and kept thanking me over and over. As we started walking, she explained that her phone had been stolen along with her food stamp card, so she couldn't call her boyfriend or use GPS. She said she'd been walking around for 2 hours trying to find his place. We headed toward the jail, taking the main roads first. The girl said some things looked familiar, but she wasn't sure if we were going the right way. She mentioned her boyfriend's house had a red door and a broken mailbox, which described about half the houses in that neighborhood. I was starting to sober up from all the walking and wondering if this was a good idea. My feet were starting to hurt, and I was thinking about those steaks getting cold back home. We'd been walking for almost an hour when she suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed at a small white house. She said that was definitely it because she recognized the broken garden gnome in the yard. We walked up the cracked driveway, and I noticed the red door she'd mentioned. The mailbox was indeed hanging off its post. She seemed so relieved to finally find the place that she practically ran up the front steps. I hung back on the walkway, figuring I'd make sure she got inside safely, then head home. The girl didn't knock or ring the doorbell. She just turned the handle and walked right in, which seemed odd, but I figured maybe they had that kind of relationship. I was about to turn and leave when the door swung back open, but it wasn't the girl standing there. It was a man holding a pistol pointed directly at my chest. "Wallet and phone now," he said in a voice that meant business. My hands went up automatically and I fumbled to get my wallet out of my back pocket. The beer buzz was completely gone, replaced by ice-cold fear. I handed over my phone and wallet while trying to see past him into the house. The man grabbed my stuff and then did something I wasn't expecting. Instead of slamming the door or telling me to run, he reached out with his free hand and grabbed my shirt. He yanked me forward with surprising strength, and I stumbled through the doorway into the house. The door slammed shut behind me and I heard the deadbolt click. Inside the house was dark, except for light coming from what looked like the kitchen. I could hear voices but couldn't make out words. The man with the gun pushed me forward down a narrow hallway. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Had the girl been bait to rob helpful people, or was this something worse? We entered the kitchen, and I saw the girl sitting at a small table. She wasn't crying anymore. In fact, she was counting money and drinking a beer like nothing had happened. 2 other men were standing by the sink going through what looked like other wallets and phones. The table was covered with driver's licenses and credit cards from multiple people. The girl looked up at me and smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who'd won a game. She took a sip of her beer and said something to one of the men in Russian. They all laughed, and I realized how much trouble I was in. This wasn't random. This was a well-practiced routine, and I'd walked right into it. The man with the gun pushed me toward a door that looked like it led to a basement. One of the other men opened it, revealing wooden stairs going down into darkness. I could hear something down there. Movement, and maybe breathing of multiple people. The girl stood up from the table, still holding her beer. She walked over to me and leaned in close. I could smell the alcohol on her breath mixed with something else. Maybe fear or excitement. She reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out the receipt from the liquor store Rebecca and I had visited earlier. She looked at it and her smile got wider. "Your wife Rebecca is probably wondering where you are by now. Maybe we should give her a call and invite her to the party too." Receipt back in my pocket with that same cold smile. One of the men grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the basement door, while the girl followed behind, still holding my phone. The wooden stairs creaked under our weight as we went down into the darkness. My eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the dim light from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. 4 people were sitting against the concrete walls with their hands zip-tied in front of them. A woman with gray hair looked up at me with tired eyes. 3 men sat next to her, including one in a postal uniform. They all looked scared and exhausted. The man with the gun pushed me down against the wall next to them, while the girl stood at the bottom of the stairs typing something on my phone. She held it up, showing me she'd opened my contacts and had Rebecca's number ready to call. The woman next to me whispered that her name was Vera, and she'd been here for 3 days. The girl heard her and walked over, crouching down in front of me. She said if I didn't give her my banking passwords right now, she'd call my wife and tell her I was hurt and needed her to come to this address immediately. My stomach turned thinking about Rebecca walking into this trap. I gave her most of my PINs, but changed one number on my main checking account, hoping to buy some time. She went back upstairs to test them while the man watched us with his gun. 5 minutes passed before I heard angry footsteps coming back down. The girl's face was red and she was yelling that one PIN didn't work. The man walked over and kicked me hard in the ribs. Pain shot through my side as I gasped and gave her the correct number. She went back upstairs again while I tried to catch my breath. Vera leaned over and whispered that the girl was the smart one who ran everything while the men just did what she said. She said the girl had been talking about expanding to hit more houses each night. After about 10 minutes, the girl came back down looking pleased. She said my accounts had good balances and we'd be making a trip soon. The man untied me from the wall and pushed me toward the stairs. Back in the kitchen, the two other men were stuffing wallets and phones into black garbage bags. The table was covered with even more driver's licenses than before. The girl grabbed my face and held my phone up to unlock it with facial recognition. The screen lit up and she started opening my banking apps one by one. I tried entering wrong passwords first, hoping to trigger fraud alerts, but she caught on immediately. She held up my phone showing Rebecca's contact again and said she'd already typed a message saying I was bringing friends home from the bar. Her finger hovered over the send button. I stopped messing around and entered my real passwords. She pulled out a notebook and started writing down all my account numbers and balances. She seemed happy when she saw our savings account that we'd been building for 5 years. The men were discussing in Russian about their next ATM run and kept checking the time. I told them I'd go with them to make sure the withdrawals worked, hoping maybe I could signal someone for help. The girl thought about it, then agreed, but said if I tried anything, she had my wife's info and our home address from my license. She showed me the text to Rebecca again to make sure I understood. One of the men brought out a bag of zip ties and pulled my hands in front of me, tightening the plastic until it cut into my wrists. They pushed me out a side door into an old van parked in the driveway. Inside the van, I saw another man already zip-tied in the back. I recognized him immediately as Tucker Goodwin, who lived 3 streets over from us. His face was pale and sweaty. He whispered that his wife thought he was at a work emergency and his kids were waiting for him at home. The girl got in the passenger seat while one man drove and the other sat in back watching us. We pulled up to an ATM at a gas station about 10 minutes away. The man in back cut Tucker's zip ties and pushed him out of the van. I watched through the window as Tucker walked to the ATM with the girl right behind him. His hands were shaking as he put in his card and entered his PIN. He withdrew the maximum amount, and the girl took the cash immediately. Tucker got back in the van looking defeated and told me quietly that his kids were home alone and he just wanted this to be over. Then it was my turn. The man cut my zip ties, and I stepped out trying to position myself so the ATM camera would get a clear shot of my face. I mouthed the words, "Help me," while pretending to have trouble with the keypad buttons. The girl stood about 2 feet away but was smart enough to stay out of the camera's view. I withdrew the daily maximum from my checking account first, then my savings, then my credit card cash advance. Each time the machine spit out money and the girl grabbed it quickly. We got back in the van and Tucker leaned over to whisper something important. He said when they grabbed him earlier, our neighbor with the doorbell camera was outside and definitely saw the van's license plate. The criminals were talking in Russian up front and didn't hear him. We stopped at 2 more ATMs, but when they wanted more, I explained that banks have daily limits and we couldn't get more until midnight when they reset. The girl pulled out her phone and searched for bank withdrawal limits. She read for a minute, then nodded and said I was telling the truth. We'd have to wait until after midnight for the limits to reset. They drove us back to the house, and as we pulled into the driveway, I saw a delivery truck pulling away from the curb. One of the men jumped out of the van and ran after the truck waving his arms, but it was already turning the corner. He came back carrying a package that had been left on the porch and kept looking around like he expected cops to jump out of the bushes. The man with the gun pushed Tucker and me back down into the basement where the other people were still tied up against the walls. The woman named Vera scooted closer to me once the men went back upstairs. She kept her voice low and told me she'd been listening to them talk for 3 days and heard them mention they'd been running this operation for 6 months. Based on all the wallets and IDs she'd seen them sorting through upstairs, she figured they must have grabbed at least 40 people, maybe more. The plastic zip ties were cutting into my wrists, and I started working them against a rough section of pipe that ran along the wall. Vera positioned herself to block the view from the stairs in case anyone came down. The plastic was thick, but the pipe had a sharp edge where it connected to the wall bracket, and I kept sawing back and forth, feeling it slowly start to give. My wrists were getting raw and bleeding a little, but I kept going. Footsteps came down the stairs and the girl appeared holding my phone. She showed me the screen where Rebecca had texted asking when I'd be home because it was getting late. The girl made me watch while she typed back that I was helping a neighbor with car trouble and would be another hour or 2. She hit send before I could say anything. A minute later, Rebecca responded with a heart emoji and said she'd put my dinner in the fridge and was heading to bed. The normal, everyday feeling of that message made my chest tight because Rebecca had no idea what was happening just 15 minutes from our house. The girl smiled at me and went back upstairs. I kept working on the zip ties while Tucker sat against the wall looking broken. Around 11, the sounds upstairs changed, and I could hear them moving around more, getting ready for something. They were arguing in Russian and English about who should go on the midnight ATM run. The girl's voice cut through, saying she wanted to take me again since my accounts had the highest balances. I called up the stairs that my bank would lock the accounts if I tried multiple withdrawals in one day because of fraud protection. The girl came down looking suspicious and pulled out her phone to check. She typed for a few minutes reading different bank websites, then looked at Tucker. I told her his accounts wouldn't have the same restrictions since he banked somewhere else. She seemed to buy it and yelled something up in Russian. 2 of the men came down and cut Tucker's zip ties, then dragged him up the stairs. The van started outside and pulled away. While they were gone, I worked harder on my zip ties and finally felt the plastic snap on one wrist. My hand slipped free, but I kept both hands together so it would look like I was still tied up. Vera saw what I'd done and moved closer to help hide it. She whispered that the window near the ceiling had bars on the outside, so even if we broke the glass, we couldn't get through. We heard the van come back about 30 minutes later. The door opened, and Tucker stumbled down the stairs. His nose was bleeding and his eye was starting to swell shut. He dropped down next to me and whispered that he'd tried to run at the ATM, but they caught him right away. The one with the gun had punched him twice, and then told him they knew where his kids went to the school and what time his wife left for work. Tucker was shaking and kept wiping blood from his nose with his shoulder since his hands were tied again. Upstairs, the girl's phone rang and she answered it in Russian. Her voice got loud and angry real fast. She was yelling at whoever was on the other end, and I could hear her pacing back and forth across the kitchen floor. One of the men said something that sounded worried, and I heard him walk to the front window. He said something else in Russian, and the girl yelled back at him. The call went on for another few minutes with her voice getting more and more upset. When she finally hung up, she slammed something down on the table hard enough that we heard it in the basement. The men were talking fast now, and one of them kept going to the windows like he was watching for something. I tested my free hand carefully, making small movements to get feeling back in my fingers. Tucker leaned against the wall with his eyes closed and blood still dripping from his nose. Vera kept watching the stairs and whispered that something was definitely wrong because she'd never heard them sound this worried before. The girl came to the top of the stairs and looked down at us for a long moment without saying anything. Her face was different now, like she was trying to make a decision about something. She went back to the kitchen, and we could hear them pulling things out of drawers and cabinets. It sounded like they were packing up. One of them ran up the stairs to the second floor, and we heard him moving around up there too. They were getting ready to leave, and I didn't know if that was good or bad for us down in the basement. A siren started wailing somewhere close, and everyone upstairs went totally quiet. The footsteps stopped, and I heard someone rush to the front window. The siren got louder and louder until it sounded like it was right outside the house. My heart was pounding, so hard I thought they might hear it upstairs. The siren peaked, and then started fading as the cop car passed by without stopping. One of the men started yelling in Russian, and it sounded like he wanted to leave right now. The girl yelled back, and I heard her say something about a safe. She was telling them they couldn't leave without cleaning it out first. More arguing, and then footsteps coming down to the basement. One of the men came down with his gun out and stood at the bottom of the stairs watching us. He looked nervous and kept glancing back up the stairs every few seconds. Above us, I could hear them dragging something heavy across the floor. It sounded like they were packing everything they could carry. I slowly moved my free hand behind my back and tested the basement door handle. It turned easily, and the door cracked open just a tiny bit. They'd forgotten to lock it in their rush to pack. I caught Vera's eye and nodded toward the door. She saw what I meant and moved closer to Tucker, who was still holding his bloody nose. The guard was looking up the stairs again and yelling questions in Russian. Someone yelled back, and he took a few steps up to hear better. I pushed the door open wider and looked out into the hallway. It was empty, and I could see light from the front room. The guard came back down, but he was still looking up at the ceiling, listening to all the noise. I helped Tucker stand up, and Vera got under his other arm to support him. We started moving toward the door as quiet as we could. The guard was back on the stairs, yelling up more questions. We slipped through the door and into the hallway. My legs were shaking from being tied up so long, but I forced myself to keep moving. We crept up the wooden stairs, and each creak sounded as loud as a gunshot to me. Tucker was trying not to lean too heavy on us, but I could tell he was still dizzy. We made it to the top of the stairs, and the front door was maybe 10 feet away. I could see the deadbolt was unlocked, and my hand was reaching for the doorknob when the girl stepped out of the kitchen. She was holding my phone in one hand and something black in the other hand. She shouted something in Russian and raised the black thing toward me. I saw the little metal prongs right before she pulled the trigger. The taser wires shot out and hit me in the chest. Every muscle in my body locked up at once, and I dropped straight to the floor. The pain was like nothing I'd ever felt before. I couldn't move or speak or even breathe right. Tucker and Vera just stood there frozen while the girl kept the trigger pulled. The men came running from different rooms and grabbed all three of us. They dragged us back down to the basement, and this time, they weren't messing around with zip ties. They had actual chains and padlocks that they wrapped around our wrists and ankles. The girl came down looking mad as hell. She said we'd forced them to speed up their timeline, and now they had to leave tonight. She pulled out my phone and showed me she was dialing Rebecca's number. I tried to say something, but my mouth still wasn't working right from the taser. She let it ring once, then hung up before it could connect. She said that was my last warning, and if we tried anything else, she would let it ring through and tell Rebecca to come pick me up. About 20 minutes later, they brought someone new down to the basement. It was a young guy wearing one of those food delivery shirts, and he was crying hard. He kept saying he only had $30 in his bank account and begging them to let him go. They chained him to the wall next to Tucker and went back upstairs. The delivery guy was shaking and asking us what was happening. Vera told him to stay quiet and save his energy. I could still feel the taser burns on my chest, and every movement hurt. Upstairs, they were moving faster now, and I heard the van doors opening and closing outside. The girl came back down and looked at the delivery driver. She said his car and delivery account would be useful for checking out houses without anyone getting suspicious. The guy started crying harder, and she just laughed. She went over to Tucker and checked his chains to make sure they were tight. She said something about how the boat wouldn't wait past dawn, so they needed to finish packing the safe. One of the men yelled down that they found more cash in the upstairs closet. The girl smiled and said this had been their best house yet. She looked at me and said my bank accounts alone would fund their next 3 months of operations. Then she went back upstairs and I heard her telling the men to load the heavy bags first. The delivery driver was trying to pull his hands through the chains, but they were way too tight. Tucker had his eyes closed and was breathing heavy through his mouth since his nose was still messed up. Vera kept watching the stairs like she was planning something, but I couldn't tell what. The chains were different from the zip ties because we couldn't work on breaking them. All we could do was sit there and listen to them getting ready to leave with everything they'd stolen from us. The girl walked over to the delivery driver who was still shaking and crying against the wall. She crouched down in front of him and patted his cheek hard enough to make him focus on her face. She told him to stop crying because they had work for him to do. She said his delivery car with those magnetic signs would be perfect for checking out nice houses without anyone calling the cops. The driver just stared at her with his mouth open like he couldn't believe this was real. She stood up and told one of the men something in Russian that made him laugh. Then she looked back at us and said they'd been doing this for 6 months and had their system down perfect. She said the delivery apps made it easy to see who ordered expensive food and wine because those people usually had money. The driver started crying harder when he heard that, and she just shook her head like he was being a baby. One of the men came down and said something that made her smile real wide. She told us they'd found another safe upstairs with at least $10,000 in cash. The way she said it made me think they'd hit the jackpot with this house. Time kept dragging, and I could feel myself getting tired even though my heart was still racing from fear. My wrists hurt bad from the chains, and my chest still burned from where the taser hit me earlier. I looked over at Vera and saw her head dropping forward like she was falling asleep sitting up. Tucker was just staring at the wall with this blank look on his face like his brain had checked out. The delivery driver kept making these little whimpering sounds that were getting on everyone's nerves. I tried to stay alert by counting the footsteps above us and listening to what they were doing. It sounded like they were dragging heavy stuff across the floor, and I could hear the front door opening and closing over and over. Around what felt like 2 in the morning, the exhaustion really hit me hard. My eyes kept trying to close, and I had to shake my head to stay awake. Vera had given up fighting it and was sleeping against the wall with her chin on her chest. Tucker hadn't moved in what felt like an hour and just kept staring at nothing with his eyes half open. The delivery driver had finally stopped crying and was breathing heavy through his mouth. Outside, I heard car doors slamming and what sounded like the van being loaded with bags. They were definitely getting ready to clear out, and I wondered what that meant for us. Were they going to leave us here chained up or something worse? The girl came back down the stairs holding my phone and looking pleased with herself. She walked over and held the screen up so I could see my banking app was open. She'd figured out how to transfer money from my savings to my checking account and showed me she'd moved the maximum daily amount. She said the morning withdrawal limit would reset at 6, and they'd clean out the rest before leaving town. The way she knew all the banking rules and limits told me she'd done this many times before. She scrolled through my other accounts, and I saw she'd already tried to increase my credit card cash advance limits. She mentioned something about having a boat waiting at the marina that would take them out before dawn. She looked almost sad when she said their time here was ending, but that they'd made enough to set up somewhere new. One of the men came down and unlocked the chains holding Tucker to the pipe. Tucker tried to stand, but his legs were shaky, and the man had to pull him up by his arm. They dragged him up the stairs, and I heard the van doors open and close. The engine started, and I heard it drive away down the street. Vera woke up when she heard the noise and looked around confused. She asked where Tucker was, and I told her they'd taken him somewhere. We both knew that probably wasn't good, but neither of us said it out loud. 20 minutes went by with no sound of the van coming back. Vera and I kept looking at each other, and I could see she was thinking the same thing I was. What did they do with Tucker, and were we next? Finally, we heard the van pull back into the driveway, but Tucker didn't come back down to the basement. The men were talking upstairs in Russian, and it sounded like they were arguing about something. Vera whispered that maybe Tucker got away, or maybe they dumped him somewhere. Either way, we both knew our time was running out. The house got real quiet after that, except for footsteps pacing back and forth upstairs. It sounded like just one person walking around while the others were probably sleeping or keeping watch. I started working on my chains again and found that one of the links near my wrist was orange with rust. I pulled and twisted it over and over, feeling it give just a tiny bit each time. The metal was old and weak, and I thought maybe with enough pressure it might actually break. Vera saw what I was doing and scooted closer to block the view from the stairs in case someone came down. The delivery driver had been quiet for a while, but suddenly started breathing real fast and making these gasping sounds. His whole body was shaking and he was pulling at his chains, so hard I thought he might break his wrists. Vera tried to calm him down by talking soft, but he was way past listening to anyone. He started screaming that he couldn't breathe and needed to get out right now. His noise brought the man with the gun running down the stairs looking mad as hell. The guy walked straight over to the delivery driver and hit him once hard across the face. The driver's head snapped back and hit the wall, and he went quiet except for some moaning. The man said something about keeping our mouths shut if we wanted to see morning. The casual way he used violence like it was nothing made it real clear they were getting desperate as their deadline got closer. Dawn was coming, and they needed to be gone before people started waking up and going to work. The rusted link gave way with a sharp snap that sounded way too loud in the quiet basement. The chain fell loose from the wall but stayed wrapped tight around my ankle like a metal snake. I stood up slow and careful, testing if my legs would hold after sitting for so long. Vera watched me take a few shaky steps and nodded when she saw I could move okay. The basement door crashed open and Tucker came tumbling down the stairs, landing hard on his hands and knees. His face had dried blood under his nose and his shirt was torn at the shoulder. He pushed himself up and looked at us with wild eyes. He told us they'd taken him to 3 different ATMs and made him empty his accounts, but at the last one, he'd pretended to have trouble with the keypad. The security guard came over to help, and Tucker managed to mouth the word help while the criminals watched from the van. The guard called it in right away, and Tucker said he saw him talking fast into his radio as they drove off. That's when we heard them, sirens getting louder and closer every second. The criminals upstairs started yelling at each other in Russian and English, and I could hear furniture being shoved around. The girl's voice cut through everything, screaming about the boat leaving in 30 minutes and how they needed to go now. Heavy footsteps pounded down the basement stairs, and all 3 of them appeared at once. The girl pointed at me and said I was coming with them as insurance. The man with the gun grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the stairs, while the girl held my phone up to my face. The screen lit up and unlocked, showing all my apps and messages. She shoved it in her pocket and pushed me from behind to move faster. As they dragged me up the stairs, I spotted a heavy metal flashlight sitting on a shelf near the top. Without thinking, I grabbed it and swung hard at the gunman's knee. The crack was awful, and he went down screaming, his gun sliding across the kitchen floor. The girl dove for it, but Vera had followed us up and kicked it under the stove before she could reach it. The third man looked at all of us, then at the flashing red and blue lights filling the windows, and ran straight out the back door. Police cars screeched to a stop outside, and I could hear doors slamming and voices shouting commands. The front door exploded open, and officers rushed in with guns drawn, yelling for everyone to get down. The girl dropped to her knees instantly with her hands up, tears already streaming down her face. She started sobbing and saying they forced her to help, that they had her sister back in Russia and would hurt her if she didn't do what they said. Her whole body shook, and she looked so young and scared that even I almost believed her for a second. But I told the cops everything, talking fast about the basement full of people and how she'd been running the whole operation. More officers came down and found the delivery driver and the others still chained up. They called for bolt cutters and paramedics while securing the house. Detective Marshall showed up about 20 minutes later wearing a wrinkled suit and looking tired. He took one look at the setup and shook his head like he'd seen this before. He told me this matched cases in 3 other states where they'd been tracking this group for months. The last house they hid in Missouri, an old man had a heart attack and died when they wouldn't let him get his medicine. He said we were lucky Tucker got word out when he did. The paramedics checked everyone over, shining lights in our eyes and taking blood pressure readings. My wrists were raw and bleeding from the chains, and I had burns on my chest from the taser. They wanted to take me to the hospital, but I needed to call Rebecca first. When I finally got a phone and heard her voice, I almost lost it completely. She was already in the car driving here because Tucker's wife had called her after the police contacted her about Tucker. She kept saying my name over and over and asking if I was really okay. I told her I was fine even though my whole body hurt and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. The paramedic took the phone and told her which hospital they were taking me to. I watched them load the girl and the gunman into separate police cars, while crime scene people started photographing everything. The table still had all those stolen licenses and credit cards spread out like some sick collection. Vera sat next to me on the ambulance bumper with a blanket around her shoulders. She said she'd been sure we were going to die down there. Tucker was already in another ambulance getting his nose looked at. The delivery driver was the worst off because he'd been down there the longest without food or water. They had him on a stretcher with an IV already going. Detective Marshall came over with a notebook and started asking me questions about everything that happened from the beginning. I told him about the crying girl at my door and how real it had seemed. He wrote everything down and said I'd need to come to the station later for a full statement. The whole street was blocked off now with police cars and news vans already showing up. I could see my neighbors standing in their yards watching everything unfold. The house that had seemed so normal from the outside was now wrapped in yellow tape. The paramedics loaded me into the ambulance and we headed to the hospital with lights flashing while one of them cleaned the burns on my chest from the taser. At the emergency room, they wheeled me straight back and a nurse started cutting the zip tie pieces still stuck to my wrists, while another one took my blood pressure and checked my vitals. The taser burns looked worse than they felt. 2 angry red marks about 3 inches apart that the doctor said would probably scar, but shouldn't cause any lasting damage. Detective Marshall showed up while they were wrapping my wrists and pulled a chair next to my bed with his notebook out. He asked me to go through everything again from the beginning, and I told him about the girl showing up crying at our door and how real it had seemed. He nodded and said they'd been tracking this group for months across multiple states, and the girl was actually on the FBI's wanted list for similar crimes in Missouri and Kansas. The nurse came back with some papers for me to sign when Rebecca burst through the curtain and grabbed me so tight I couldn't breathe. She kept saying she was sorry over and over, that she should have never encouraged me to help that girl, that she should have come with me instead of staying home. I told her there was no way we could have known, and that these people were professionals who'd done this dozens of times before. She wouldn't let go of my hand, even when the doctor came back to check the bandages one more time. 3 weeks went by before Detective Marshall called to tell me they'd caught the other 2 men at a border crossing trying to get into Canada with fake IDs. He said Tucker and I would need to testify, but the evidence was overwhelming with the doorbell camera footage, ATM recordings, and all the stolen property they'd found in the house. The bank called a few days later saying they'd reversed most of the fraudulent charges after reviewing the ATM footage that clearly showed my zip-tied hands. Our homeowner's insurance covered the rest of the stolen money after we filed a claim with all the police reports attached. Rebecca went out the next day and bought 3 security cameras that she made me install on every corner of our house, plus a new alarm system that cost more than our car payment. She also got one of those video doorbells that lets you see who's there before you open up. 6 months passed before the trial finally happened, and I had to sit in that courtroom looking at the girl who'd almost destroyed our lives. She tried to keep up her victim act, but the prosecutor had recordings of her speaking perfect English and running the whole operation. The judge gave her 15 years, while the men each got 20 for armed robbery and kidnapping. That same week, I got a card in the mail from Vera saying she'd moved to live closer to her daughter and was doing better, though she still had nightmares sometimes. Tucker started coming over for beers on Fridays, and we'd sit on my back deck not really talking about what happened, but both knowing why we were there. His wife, Sarah, started a neighborhood watch program and actually got people to show up to the meetings, probably because everyone had heard what happened to us. She made these flyers with safety tips and phone numbers to call if you saw something suspicious. Rebecca and I grew closer after everything because we'd faced real danger and made it through together. We stopped taking our quiet evenings for granted, and she'd hold my hand tighter when we walked around the neighborhood. The boring routine we'd complained about before now felt like the greatest gift in the world. Our whole neighborhood changed after those criminals got caught because everyone started actually looking out for each other instead of just waving when they got their mail. People exchanged phone numbers and kept an eye on each other's houses when someone went out of town. I learned the hard way that helping people is good, but you have to protect yourself and your family first. That girl had used our kindness against us and nearly destroyed everything we'd worked for. Now when someone comes to our door asking for help, I check the video doorbell first and keep the chain on while I talk to them. Rebecca doesn't give me that look anymore when someone needs help, because we both know what can happen when you trust the wrong person. The scars on my chest faded to thin white lines, but they remind me every day that not everyone who asks for help really needs it. Tucker and I still meet up every Friday, and Sarah's neighborhood watch group has grown to include 3 other streets. The criminals are serving their time, and that house with the red door got demolished after the city condemned it. Our neighborhood is safer now, but we're all a little less trusting, and maybe that's not such a bad thing when it keeps the people you love safe from harm. Well, folks, that was definitely a journey. Appreciate you being here and wandering through it all with me. Until we meet again, take care. Like the video, it helps more than you think.